It's really hard to take effective notes when you're using a textbook. There's a reason for this. The reason is that a textbook is essentially a collection of someone else's notes, right? So all that information is already distilled and presented to you in a textbook. Somebody else has done all the distilling, somebody else has done all the summarizing, somebody else has culled all the information and packaged it so as to make it as clear as possible. Now, there are some benefits to that, but the downside is that if you really want to make the material your own, it's difficult to do because, again, you're reading someone else's notes, not your own notes, right? And so it's not really personal, and it's not really tailored to the way that you think. This is my solution, and this is what I've been telling my students. When you sit down to study, here's the first thing you should do, especially when you're moving into a new lesson. Take a look at that new lesson and then ask yourself, how does this lesson relate to the previous lesson? And this is a question you should answer in your notebook explicitly, in full sentences. You should say, this lesson is related to the previous lesson in the following way. And you should explain how these lessons are related. Now, because this is sometimes difficult, I give a follow-up question which you can answer. And this will help in answering this general question, which is to say, is the current lesson expanding a methodology that was presented in the previous lesson, or is it instead building on a truth that we established in the previous lesson? So one easy illustration of this is if there's some principle or some theorem or something that was presented in the previous lesson, and then now you're using that one to build a new theorem, then that would be building on a truth, right? So if you have one principle or one mathematical formula, and now we're going to use that to produce another one, now we're building on a truth because we're using what we established before to get something new. Expanding a methodology would be where we've looked at one way of solving problems, and then we're going to solve the same types of problems with a slightly different method. Or perhaps even the most obvious way you see this is you're given a solution method and principles and whatnot in one lesson, and then in the next lesson you have word problems where you're solving the same problems, but now the problems are given to you as word problems rather than just math equations. That would be expanding a methodology. That's the first thing you should answer in your notebook. How are these two lessons related? Now, the reason for this is because if you see how the lessons are related, you're much less likely to feel disoriented because you're constantly linking things together for yourself. And you might think, yeah, isn't it obvious enough? I can just do this in my head. Why do I have to write it down? Well, it's because oftentimes, unless we're forcing ourselves to pay attention, we simply don't pay attention. And that's what writing stuff down does. It forces you to pay attention to these things on a deeper level than you might otherwise. And so even if you think, well, I know what's going on, I can see what's happening, it's way better for you if you actually write it out. It'll also stick better in your memory, so you have a better memory of what the lesson's about. Okay, so that's the first thing. First thing is link the lessons together by answering this question: how are these lessons related? And is this current lesson building on the previous lesson by expanding a methodology or by building on a previous truth? Some lessons will do neither of these things, but those are usually the exception. And usually where you see that is when you're beginning like a new chapter or something in the book, right? Okay, so that's one way of writing in response to a textbook, which again is difficult to do because it's a collection of someone else's notes. So the second thing I ask my students to write, so first thing is answer this basic question. The second thing is look through the lesson, read the lesson, and then list or summarize the key concepts that you need to understand before you would really know the material in the lesson. Now, one of the secrets is that most textbooks actually have this information at the beginning of the lesson, usually like in a little box or something. The problem, though, is that textbook authors haven't figured out that we've been trained to ignore stuff that appears in boxes around text because it looks like advertisements to us, and we are constantly bombarded with ads. So we've actually been trained by our interaction with media to ignore stuff in colorful boxes around text. So if you don't believe me, by the way, go back and look over some old textbooks that you've recently used and see how much of the stuff in the boxes you don't remember reading. And it's because you just didn't even notice it was there. because that's what's happened to our brains. And so the textbook authors still think that by putting stuff in boxes, they're highlighting information, even though they're actually hiding it from you. So one of the secrets is actually look at those boxes, and sometimes this information is given to you explicitly in the boxes, like here's a list of the things we're going to cover in this chapter, right? And that's stuff you could summarize and then put in your own words and put into your notebook. The other thing, so this is the third thing now. So first thing, answer the question. Second thing, summarize or list the key concepts that you really need to understand to proceed. Thirdly, what you need to do is you need to look it through the lesson and identify anything that needs to be memorized. Because oftentimes in a lesson, you'll have stuff that you need to memorize. So anything that needs to be memorized, copy it directly into your notebook as well. Now, a student might ask, well, why do I need to copy it? Can't I just go back to the lesson to look at it? What's the point if I'm going to be memorizing it? Well, actually copying it into your notes is a first step in memorizing. It also gives you a second place where you can return to look at this information. But one of the best ways of memorizing something is to actually engage not just the mind, but also the body in the process of learning. And one excellent way of engaging the body is to actually write. So there you're encountering the information not only with your mind, but you're also engaging with your muscles through writing, and that's going to really solidify that even better in your mind, which again is one of the reasons why you should be writing as you're studying. So as I said, the difficulty here is that textbooks are a collection of someone else's notes. And so if you've struggled, at this point, taking good notes on a textbook, it's not you. I mean, it's just the nature of the beast, as it were. So in a perfect world, we wouldn't have this problem, I think. And this is one of the things I've tried to overcome in my Classical Math 1 guidebook, which I've written. And it's a guidebook to Euclid's Elements. And the reason I really believe in this, and in particular in this model of teaching Euclid and some of the other primary sources, is because on the one hand, it's not a textbook. So you actually have the opportunity to take essentially fresh notes for yourself. And you have to go through the process of distilling the information and representing it to yourself in your notes, which does wonders for comprehension. The second thing is, if you read someone like Euclid, you find that he's actually doing geometry, but it's an ordinary human language, which is essentially how we process most information, right? Now, granted, algebra is also a language, and it's extremely powerful and extremely useful. And the problem with word problems, as it were, is that you're doing what's called rhetorical algebra, which is what makes word problems so difficult, because now you have a simpler language of algebra, and you're trying to do algebra without that language, right? In ordinary human speech. But this practice of translating between those, going from mathematics to normal language, to mathematics, to spoken language, back and forth, is tremendous for comprehension and memory. And so again, this is one of the reasons that I teach Euclid's Elements and that I've written a guidebook to Euclid's Elements. It's because you have that experience in reading someone like Euclid. This is also true in reading Diophantus. I've also written a guidebook to Diophantus's algebra, which I'll show you. I've got, this is what they look like. So here's my guidebook to Euclid's Elements. This is a quick plug. And this is available on my website. It comes with a little exam booklet, which just gives you a way of like self-testing your knowledge as you work through Euclid's Elements. And it's really just a structured way of approaching Euclid. So I give practice problems, study questions, and whatnot to help you work through Euclid's Elements so that you can do high school geometry, but master the material in a much deeper way. The one thing I will say is it's pure geometry, and so it's not analytic geometry. And most high school textbooks today teach some geometry, but most of the time, even the geometry that they teach is an excuse to just do algebra. So my approach is a little bit different and emphasizes different things, and in particular does a really good job teaching logic, believe it or not. The other guidebook I've written is this guidebook to Diophantus's algebra. It's actually his Arithmetica, but he's considered the father of modern algebra, or the father of algebra, period, I suppose. And he does rhetorical algebra, which means it's genuinely terrible to read, but I wanted to make it accessible to high school students, and so I've written this guidebook as a way of taking you through what I think is a delightful book of algebra if you understand it properly. But you can find both of those on my website. So I hope that that's interesting. I hope that you found this video helpful, and in particular that these strategies I've presented for how to engage with textbooks will help you. If you're a teacher, help you better teach your students to take effective notes and to have better study habits. And if you're a student, will help you really improve to improve the efficiency of your time spent studying, because the last thing you want to do is waste time studying math, right? I mean, you spend so much time already studying. You want to make the best use of that time that you have, and I think this is one way to do that. So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you in the next one.